All right, here is our next to the last video on endangered species. Endangered species are species that are at risk of going extinct in the near future. What does it mean to be extinct? We usually consider species that were alive as recently as the year 1500, but are no longer in existence, so they've all died out. The reason why we tend to consider those that are alive as of the year 1500 are to eliminate any species that went extinct before humans were kind of wandering around killing a lot of species, so that we can take into account which species that humans may have been responsible for driving them into extinction. By the way, this graphic is showing you what percent of species in each of these groups are endangered or at threat of going extinct. So, for example, about 44% of reef corals are estimated to be endangered or critically endangered or vulnerable. About 41% of amphibians, 38% of tree species, 37% of sharks and rays. You'll notice that the species group with the lowest amount of these endangered or threatened species is birds. But we're basically seeing that a lot of organisms across the board in many different categories are at risk of going extinct. So, how do we classify organisms? Well, the IUCN, which is an international organization, does studies of populations and uses specific criteria to place species into one of these categories that you see in the diagram right here. So, if they are extinct, that means there are no longer any known living individuals from that species in existence. Now, have species been declared extinct and then we find some other individuals? Yes. If these species are usually found in kind of dense or hard to find areas or hard to reach areas, and nobody sees an example of them for 10 or 15 years, they may be declared extinct. And then, some researcher or individual finds them, an example of them still alive, and they may be removed from the extinction list. But if they're declared extinct, they probably have a tiny population. If they are extinct in the wild, that means the only examples of them left, the only individuals left are in captivity, meaning in zoos, captive breeding programs, not usually in nature preserves. That doesn't count as being in captivity so much because they're not held isolated. Then you have critically endangered. These are the ones that are probably the most vulnerable and without some immediate intervention are most likely in danger of risk of going extinct soon. Endangered, that is less vulnerable than critically endangered, but still there are limitations in the populations that exist in the wild, which means that without protections, they will likely go extinct in the future. Vulnerable, again, less threatened than endangered. Then you have near threatened. They're at risk of moving into the endangered category. These threatened categories that you see right here in the red dashed line box, but they're not quite that endangered yet. Then you have conservation dependent are going to be ones that are requiring conservation, like captive breeding programs or protected habitats and things like that to keep them from going into the more endangered categories. You have least concern. These are species that we don't got to worry about. So, for example, humans, there are billions of us. We don't seem to be at risk of going endangered anytime soon. So, we would be listed as least concern. Data deficient are for species that we know they exist, but we just don't have enough data on how many of them there are, how many of them there should be in the wild. These may be either more recently discovered or they may be in habitats where it's very hard to take population counts, like some of these organisms that live in very deep ocean areas. We just haven't done enough exploring to figure out, okay, what's the normal population of them and is their population decreasing? And then finally, we have not evaluated, meaning we know they exist, but we know even less about them than the data deficient species. So, what are some of the risk factors to a species becoming extinct? Well, if a species is hunted, overhunted, overfished, overexploited, so what you see here at the top diagram, this is a mountain of bison skulls. So in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, there was extensive hunting of buffalo in North America to the point where they came very close to going extinct in the wild. And as you can see from this mountain of skulls, that just shows you the sheer volume of them that were hunted. So some examples of that, there's the American bison, and then there's the African elephant, which is often hunted for the tusks, the ivory tusks that they have. Having a limited diet, this would be things like pandas and koalas who are very restricted in what they eat. So if their food source is threatened, then their population is threatened. Being outcompeted by invasive species. One of these, an example is the Florida panther, which lives in the Everglades National Park area, and they've actually been endangered for quite a while. There were some programs to try and help their population bounce back, and then an invasive species, the Burmese python, had a very large increase in their population in the wilds of Florida, and now they're out competing some of the native species, including the Florida panther, putting them at further risk. And if they have specific or limited habitat requirements, like polar bears require sea ice, that's where they usually will have their hunting grounds as well as breeding grounds. If that sea ice disappears, then their population is going to go down. There's also the axolotl, which is native to two freshwater lakes in Mexico near Mexico City, one of which has since been drained, and the other of which has been drained in a lot of regions. So they live in these specific freshwater lakes, and when those habitats are disappearing, their population is decreasing dramatically. And by the way, this is an axolotl, more kind of the wild look, rather than the kind of pink ones. Those are actually more likely to be found in like the captive axolotls who are pets rather than the ones that live in the wild. So, organisms can either adapt or die. So, if a species is going to be at risk of becoming endangered or going extinct, it depends on some characteristics of the species itself. So, species that are able to adapt well or able to move to another area are less likely to face extinction. This means that either they are adapting to changes, that's probably going to happen if they're generalists rather than specialists, and being able to move to a new environment means that they have contiguous or continuous habitat that they can move to. So, not physically isolated. So, if you had a population, say, on an island, that would not be a population that's able to migrate or move. And so it's more likely to face extinction. Then you have pressures in the environment, selective pressures. These are conditions or factors that affect the fitness of organisms and whether or not they'll survive. So, my two examples up here, you may remember these pictures from a lesson in Unit 3. This is my panda bear and my raccoon. Panda bears are specialists. They have very specific requirements in their diet. They're case strategists, so they have few offspring at a time and take extensive care of them. So their population's not going to be able to grow rapidly, which means if something decreases their population, it can't bounce back, which is why they are endangered. There are a lot of zoos and other programs that are trying to increase their population. Raccoons, on the other hand, probably not likely to become endangered anytime soon. They are generalists. They eat a wide variety of foods. They can adapt to a lot of conditions, including the encroachment of cities and urban habitats. So that's why you'll see raccoons in potentially in your yard, digging through your trash. And while they're not quite R strategists, they are kind of in between K and R strategists. They have some characteristics of both. And if they're being a K or an R strategist is a spectrum. They're more towards the R strategist side than, say, pandas, which makes them less likely to go extinct because their population can increase more rapidly than pandas. So competition can affect whether species become endangered as well. There are lots of things that species compete for. And if the competition does not go in the favor of one species, it can drive them to become endangered or become extinct. This is especially a big risk when you have invasive species because they don't have population controls like native species would, like predators or other competitors that have evolved. Kind of co-evolved with those species to be able to respond to their competition. So what you see in the picture here is an alligator and a Burmese python fighting each other. And Burmese pythons and alligators can compete for the same prey. If the Burmese pythons are able to get more of the prey than the alligators, then they could drive alligators to become endangered. So we know there are endangered species. How do we protect these populations? So there are a few things you have to watch out for, one of which is poaching, the illegal killing or trafficking of an organism. Trafficking would be like selling the live animals. So, for instance, if you watch Tiger King, there are these private places that own tigers. They might traffic in or sell like tiger cubs to be able to raise them in captivity so that way they can be a little more used to humans. But there's also a lot of trade in body parts of various organisms. You can have trade in endangered plants as well as an endangered species. And when you have this poaching or illegal hunting of organisms, then it can decrease their populations, it decreases biodiversity, their genetic diversity, all of which are, of course, negative impacts. This is criminalized in a lot of countries, especially when a species is recognized as endangered or threatened. And we're going to talk on just a couple of more slides away some of the legislation that's been involved in criminalizing this practice. Then you can also protect animal habitats. So there are wildlife sanctuaries that are set aside for plants and animal species that they can have undisturbed habitat without a lot of human interference. So there'll be limitations to, humans can't build roads in that area or build cities or settlements or housing. So that way they're left kind of native for the species to be able to have their undisturbed habitat. Some of these are privately owned. Some of them are owned by governments. They could be state or they could be country owned. You might even have some that are owned at like municipal levels, like cities. One big example is Kruger National Park in South Africa. It's a place where you can go on safari because they have populations of a lot of kind of endangered species that live in Africa. So black rhinos, zebras, elephants, giraffes. So they've kind of also have a trade in ecotourism where people pay money to go on safari and see these animals in their native habitat, and that money kind of helps support the costs of the park, some of which are to pay game wardens who are anti-poaching game wardens who help protect the animals who live there from people who would hunt them and try to kill them. So for instance, you might have some game wardens who are there to protect elephant populations to make sure nobody kills them to take their tusks, which is what you saw here. I forgot to point that out. So these are quite obviously tiger skins, harvested by killing tigers. These are elephant tusks. So elephants aren't really going to sit down and let you cut off their tusks. So a lot of times they will be killed and then their tusks removed so that the ivory can be sold. All right. So, we have a system of national parks here in the United States. There are about 63 of those, five of which are paired with national preserves, which are designed to not just have publicly held land, but also they're designed to serve as kind of these refuges for wildlife. And they also have a role in species conservation because they preserve these habitats, and also ecologists and other researchers can conduct research on, what happens when these ecosystems are disturbed. Or, for example, one big study was reintroducing gray wolves into Yellowstone National Park. This was done in 1995 because all of the gray wolf population in the continental United States, which is the lower 48 states that are physically connected, had been eliminated. Extirpated is the word for that. And so they reintroduced some gray wolves from populations in, I believe, Canada, and saw the ecological effects of that, and it seemed that there were these massive ecological impacts just from reintroducing gray wolves. They controlled the herbivore populations, which allowed different species of plants to flourish, which then allowed like rivers to stay stable instead of being eroded. And that was research that was done in the national park systems. So there are two major laws you need to know in connection with preserving endangered species. There's CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. That's where the CITES, the CITES, comes from, and that's of wild fauna and flora. Fauna, if you don't know, is animals. Flora is plants. So it covers plants and animals. It may cover some other species as well, like truffles, which are a type of fungus, but people just kind of dump everything into a plant and animal category. This was an international treaty signed in 1975, and its job is to monitor international trade in these animals and plants, especially that are endangered. So, for instance, that would be something that would be um, kind of evoked if you had somebody trying to buy ivory from elephant tusks, then they were trying to buy them from Africa. And this is the sale of ivory from tusks is banned in a lot of countries to make sure that there's no demand for supply. So that way, hopefully, less people would be monetarily incentivized to poach. And this bans the import and export of body parts of these species as well as just the species in general. Because in some countries, they may have a belief that certain parts of an animal are medicinal and these animals may be endangered. And so to try and eliminate that trade, the trade in them is banned in international treaty. So, a couple of success stories from these are the vicuña, which is the first organism you see up there. It is a relative of camels and llamas in South America. And so, trade in it was banned by CITES, and that resulted in an increase in their population in the wild. The same thing for the Nile crocodile, which you see on the right as well. Then here in the United States, we have the Endangered Species Act, which was officially passed in about 1973. There were a couple of variations before then and a few acts that predated it that kind of the Endangered Species Act built on, but it's a U.S. law designed to help prevent the extinction of species, and it also has some measures in there to provide for conservation efforts to help endangered populations recover. Two examples are the gray wolf and the bald eagle. The bald eagle's populations have actually recovered quite a bit. I don't remember off the top of my head if they're still protected under the Endangered Species Act, just because their populations may have recovered to the point where they no longer need that protection. In some areas, gray wolves have been removed from the protection of the Endangered Species Act just because after reintroduction, their populations increased enough so they're no longer endangered. And that is it. So we have one more lesson coming up, and then we will be done.